it goes without saying that when you're creating these trusts, and I think I've emphasized this now several times, when designing the trust, ensuring that the wording in that trust accommodates some of this flexibility is vital, and it's going to ensure that the trustee's job is that much easier. Um, so we've talked a little bit about a letter of wishes, and I find that in my practice that I commonly suggest that when we're creating a trust, the legal language is obviously in that trust, and we do our best to enable the trustees to have a good foundation of knowledge within the trust itself to ensure that they understand what they can and cannot do. But we also recognize that that trust has limits, and it may not provide all the answers. And I find that having worked with many trustees, they thrive on knowledge. They want to know what your expectations are of them. And so the more information, the more knowledge they have, the better they can do their job. And yes, families will obviously sit down and communicate with their trustees, have verbal discussions, maybe ongoing discussions annually, updating those trustees on changes, and hopefully your trustee is a part of that person with a disability's life. But what I find is very helpful is to put it in writing as well. So if you have certain wishes that you want your trustee to be aware of, and you haven't had the time to have some verbal discussions, why not address those issues in a letter to the trustee outlining what your goals are with this trust fund? Now, those wishes are not binding, of course, on your trustee, but they are highly influential. And it's important, I think, to remember that, again, trustees are looking for guidance, especially if they don't have significant knowledge about your child's, your son or daughter's needs. And so I find a letter of wishes is a great vehicle. Again, with its limitations, that it is not a binding vehicle. And I would suggest even having that letter of wishes somehow attached and available to your trustee, and even updating it on a regular basis, as the trust will be set in stone perhaps for many years, but the letter of wishes can change at any point, and because it is an informal document.
I had written on my notes when I was looking through these that I love that. That I think is something that would be really appealing to families because I think appointing a trustee is a really difficult thing for them to do. And if they have things like this where their desires, their wishes for the well-being of their son or daughter is in writing, whether or not it's legally binding, if they've done their diligence in creating a trusting relationship with the trustee, this is another way of ease their mind as they move forward, knowing that somebody else knows that.
And I think if those wishes are known, there becomes a stronger, although it's not binding on that trustee, it's influential, and it could be seen as an element of evidence if you have a trustee that, let's say, is not acting prudently, where you could bring those letter of wishes out and state clearly that this was the intention, and the intentions are not being followed. So again, I think it's just another vehicle that may be assistive to families in the overall plan.
So there's two questions online. One of them is, what if the expenditure is as basic as food? The PWD doesn't cover everything now. Many of us provide things like food.
Okay. I want to just touch on two other important elements of the trust. Again, a bit of a repeat from the March seminar, but with a true discretionary trust, there are two elements of these trusts that are vital in the drafting. The first one is that there must be what we call an ultimate beneficiary. So you have your disabled beneficiary, but for the trust to be deemed discretionary in the eyes of the ministry, there must be another beneficiary named, so that if your son or daughter should pass away and there are still funds within that trust, there needs to be an ultimate beneficiary. So that may again be a sibling, it may be a charity such as FSI, or another entity. And so there's opportunities there to name a beneficiary. But if you don't have that named beneficiary as an ultimate, the ministry will actually see that trust as collapsible by the disabled beneficiary. And a collapsible trust in the eyes of the ministry is not discretionary, it is non-discretionary, and therefore you are now limited to $200,000. So in drafting, it's absolutely vital that you have an ultimate beneficiary beyond your son or daughter to ensure that the discretionary nature of the trust continues. And many lawyers may not understand that distinction. And that's where having the disability benefit knowledge as well as the trustee and estate planning knowledge is vital.
And so I think that should answer the question that came in at the very beginning.
Yes.
What happens to the trust when the benefit dies?
And then the other important element is that commonly when we have two beneficiaries, so where we have a disabled beneficiary and then our ultimate beneficiary, trust law says that the trustee has a duty to both beneficiaries. They have an equal duty, or what we call an even-handed duty, between the disabled beneficiary and the ultimate beneficiary. Now I know that when I'm planning these trusts and we're creating an ultimate beneficiary, we're creating that ultimate beneficiary because we want to ensure that it's discretionary and it complies with the rules of the ministry. And so what we also do is we want to give the trustee that flexibility, because the intention here is to benefit your son or daughter, not necessarily the ultimate beneficiary. And so what I also encourage in the development of the trust is that the trustee be able to do away with the even-handed rule, that they can actually disperse the funds for the benefit of the disabled beneficiary without consideration for the ultimate beneficiary. And that is very important, because if that exemption is not permitted, then your trustee is in a bit of a bind. They now have this ultimate balancing act where they need to balance between the two. And that may not have been the intention when the trust was created. Any other questions on that?
If your child has no siblings, can a cousin's child or children be named? So that's if your child has
is
no
this an ultimate
siblings.
beneficiary?
So the question you're asking as the ultimate beneficiary.
It can be anybody. I mean,
Right.
it can be an individual.
Yes.
It can be a charity. It can be a family member. It can be a friend. There is no limit. The key is that you have an ultimate beneficiary to ensure that you have a full discretionary trust.
Right.
Some other administrative points, I guess, that I'll just sort of highlight is, whether or not you want to put any restrictions on your trustee in terms of investments. Most people don't think about that when they're planning, but you can guide your trustee. If there is no guidance, the legislation will provide some guidance, and typically it's, again, very reasonable, prudent investments, especially where you have a trust fund that may have a long life. It's important that you manage it conservatively, ensure that it's got income, it's got capital growth. So ensuring perhaps whether you want to have, a certain investment manager. Many families will work with advisors and may want that advisor to be engaged, and that's permissible, or any other advisor for that matter.
So the question is, does having an ultimate beneficiary avoid probate?
Well, that's a bit of a loaded question because in the context of the trust, if it's pursuant to a will, if the trust is actually created pursuant to your will would have gone through probate because your administrator would have had to have legal authority to be able to manage your trust fund. If, however, we have, let's say, a trust fund that is created outside of a will, let's say an alter ego trust, and you now pass away, there's no need for probate in those situations because that is a private trust agreement. So it really depends on how the trust originated. And probate would only be necessary if the trust was created through a will. Otherwise, there would be no probate issues. Now, there is another potential challenge, though, is that if you did not, let's say, have a list of ultimate beneficiaries, and there were still trust funds within that trust, and there were no other beneficiaries, and let's say the will did not provide for ultimate beneficiaries, then what we would have is what we call an intestate trust fund. And an intestate trust fund would then require some further administration through probate to ensure that a family chain of what the legislature has decided would be the proper distribution. So I think it goes without saying you want to have some certainty on the ultimate distribution. So there needs to be a mechanism to ensure that we don't run into a situation where we might have an intestate trust fund that now needs to be further administered, further probated in the future.
Is there another question you want to? We're okay?
Okay. The other, common question, Angela, that I get from many trustees and families, parents, is that, they want, one of the most fundamental components of planning for their children is ensuring that their child has a roof over their head. And I think it goes without saying, one of the first questions that I get is, can we have a house? Can we have a condominium? And so there are many methods in terms of condominium ownership. First of all, a person receiving provincial benefits is entitled to own their own home, and that's considered exempt. It will not eliminate their entitlement to benefits. But, there may be a situation where the person with a disability, let's just say, doesn't have capacity, could not manage a property, and it would not be prudent to put that property into their own name. And that's where, the trust itself might actually purchase the home and utilize it for the benefit of the person with a disability. So there are many ways that a home can be facilitated through a plan, but I think it's a very, very challenging area. And I know that I can spend probably an entire seminar just on housing alone. There are implications that we want to be aware of from a provincial disability benefit standpoint. We don't want the individual to lose their shelter component of $375, which I believe is the correct number still. And so strategically designing that is vital. But also, more importantly, it's thinking about the what ifs. Who's going to pay maintenance on that property? Who's going to upkeep that property? What happens if there's a special levy? Who's going to pay for it? How are we going to deal with day-to-day maintenance and repairs, modifications? So it really involves a lot of issues. I know that the PowerPoint says to beware of the $100,000 rule, and that effectively is just a reminder to families that your son and daughter that is receiving provincial benefits is now entitled to have up to $100,000 in their bank account and not lose their benefit. So, in addition to these other exempt assets, whether it be a trust fund, whether it be a vehicle, or whether it be a home, they also can have $100,000 in a bank account. And so it's important to understand those various exempt assets that are available.
So a question did come in, and it says, what if you have already bought a home with or for your child?
So if you've already bought a home for your child and it's in their name, so you've named that individual with a disability, then obviously they're now the legal owner. And once an individual is a legal owner, they control that property. And that may be fine for families that have children that could manage a property. They have capacity, and that they may not be seen as vulnerable, maybe susceptible. I think a lot of concern that I see with families is a fear that somebody else might come into the life of that person with a disability and take advantage of them because they are perhaps highly influential. If there's capacity issues, then we have a real problem because if that person now owns that property legally and they are the last holder of that property, their estate will now dictate who receives that property when they die. And if they have no capacity, then how are they going to do a will? Some other administrative matters that are important, I think, again, in the design of the trust is, what if the beneficiary passes, your son or daughter? You may want to provide some provision in the trust fund to deal with final expenses relating to that beneficiary, such as funeral expenses. And I think this is a reasonable, perspective, because that person with a disability may not have funds available in their bank accounts to cover those types of expenses during their lifetime. And then, of course, once that trust is finalized, and let's say that there is a passing of that disabled beneficiary, then the trustee can now take some steps to distribute whatever's left to those ultimate beneficiaries, recognizing that they are going to have some responsibilities around tax, completing tax returns, getting clearance certificates,